Well, good afternoon. My name is Jason Isaac. I'm the director of the Life Powered Project at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. We make the connection between human flourishing and access to affordable, reliable energy. We believe that economic prosperity and environmental leadership go hand in hand, and I am really excited to have this panel that we have lined up for you today to talk about expensive, scarce, and government-controlled, or ESG, another acronym for something else that we're going to talk about, energy discrimination. I'm really excited by our first speaker today, Governor Mike Dunleavy, governor from the state of Alaska. Spent nearly 2 decades in Northwest Arctic communities working as a teacher, principal, and superintendent. Owned an educational consulting firm and worked on a number of educational projects statewide. He served on a school board and then 2 years as board president, and then served as a state senator for 5 years. And he earned his teacher certificate and Master of Education degree from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Governor, thank you so much for being with us. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about energy discrimination and how financial institutions are targeting development of energy in Alaska and other energy producing states, if you would. And the floor is yours, Governor. Thank you so much for joining us.
I will, and I'll try and cover as much territory as possible because I think it's important. I first want to just start out by comparing Alaska with Texas so you can see where there are similarities, but where there are vast differences that are leading to, in my opinion, this discrimination, for example, in our ability to develop our resources, especially in the Arctic, but also in other parts of Alaska. So both Alaska and Texas are large states. They're both endowed with resources, a lot of resources. They both have somewhat of a culture of independence. Obviously, Texas was its own republic. Alaska is so far away, so far up here, that we have to deal with so many things with regard to the natural world, earthquakes, volcanoes, etc., that we've developed over time an independent spirit to a great degree. We're a strong Second Amendment state. There's no permit to carry up here. We are the only state on the Pacific Ocean, for example, that votes consistently Republican. There was only one time in 1964 where this state did not vote Republican. It's interesting, it's heavily unionized. It's about the second or third most unionized state in the country. It's a blue-collar state, basically. And so there are similarities, but the differences are, for example, Texas came into the Union with virtually no federal land because it was its own republic. So a culture, an ingrained culture of private land ownership is deep in Texas. In Alaska, it's a totally different story. We came into we were possessed as a territory in a purchase from Russia, a transaction that took place with Russia. This is interesting, for our resource potential as well as our geopolitical location. We were used as a resource storehouse. It started with fur seals and gold and fish, et cetera, timber, mining, and then, of course, since the 50s in Cook Inlet, and then in the 60s and 70s, the North Slope, which was a super giant. I mean, we were the producer here in North America. We were really outside of Venezuela, the Western world, outside of Mexico and Venezuela at one time. What's interesting about Alaska is this. We were not going to be allowed to become part of the Union in 1959 unless we collectivized under our Constitution all of our resources. So the huge difference in Alaska between Alaska and Texas is the landowner in Texas owns the resources. As one of my friends in Texas said, I own everything under my feet to hell and everything above me to heaven. In Alaska, the individual cannot own the resources under their feet. That was collectivized in the Statehood Act and through the Constitution. So it's the state that gets the royalty, and it's the state that owns the resource. They will lease it. Why do I say this in light of what we're talking about today? Because we are compelled to develop our resources. If you look at the language in the debate for us to become a state in the late 50s, they said we didn't have enough population for a broad-based tax, and they were correct. So they put us on a course in the collectivization of our resources for the state to lead in the development of those resources. The fish, the gold, the oil, the timber, the rare earths, the metals, the strategic metals, gas, you name it. It was to be led by the state. started to do that in the 60s. In the 50s, we had oil discovery in Cook Inlet. We were the first state to set up an export of gas. We were the first state in the country to export gas to Japan. We opened up the concept of exporting in the late 1960s. We just went back there last fall, a year ago, and celebrated the anniversary of that shipment with Tokyo Gas. We were heading in the right direction, and then the 90s hit. As you remember, in the 70s and 80s, we had TAPS, one of the most amazing engineering feats ever. You could see it from space. It was us and the North Sea that came in as a counter to the Arab oil embargoes at this time. And then the 90s hit. And in the 90s, what we had was the Clinton administration. And a growing movement in the environmental world, but also in the anti-development world. And it was focused on Alaska. And Alaska is a very interesting situation because everybody in this country believes that they own Alaska. There are many Americans that don't even realize it's a state. They believe it's a thing. It's owned by us. It's a crown jewel for America. And by God, we're going to do everything we can to make sure that we don't destroy that particular jewel like we've destroyed our own states. And so during the Clinton administration, things started to be shut down here in the state of Alaska. The Tongass, which produced tremendous amounts of timber, was destroyed by the Clinton administration through the roadless rule. President Trump, and by the way, I'll make this statement. President Trump has been the best president in the history of this state, short state's history. Countless things this president and this administration has done. They restored the ability to use the Tongass National Forest and revised the roadless rule. The Tongass National Forest is the largest national forest in this country by far. We have a smaller timber industry right now than the state of Rhode Island. Even though we have 1/7 of the country's timber, we have the largest national forest, then we have the second largest national forest with the Chugach National Forest. Because of what has happened with the environmental movement, the preservation movement, and the no development, no growth movement, we have a smaller timber industry than the state of Rhode Island. This is what this country, we are the canary in the mine. This is what this country is going to be facing. We just faced it a little earlier. Greenpeace was formed in 1970 in an attempt to stop nuclear tests in Alaska at Chitka. So you can see how Alaska is played into this environmental movement. But again, the irony is our charge by Statehood Act and Constitution is we must develop our resources. We are the one state that is compelled and had our resources collectivized. So you can see the issue that we're dealing with. On the one hand, we come into the union and we're forced to collectivize and forced to develop our resources. Fine, let's develop our resources. But on the other hand now, we're fighting the federal government. And we will be fighting the federal government, and have been, because they want us to stop producing our resources. They want us to stop exploring. Now we have this new phenomenon of financial institutions that have now decided through their shareholders, that the culture's changing, whatever, that many of them are going to disengage from fossil fuel investment. We have a number of oil giants that are sending out signals that they are going to start to disengage from fossil fuel investment, exploration, development, shipment, etc. And they've decided to make Alaska the target. They've decided to make the Arctic the target. Now, Alaska, just like Texas, Nevada, other states that are rich in resources, we not only provide jobs and opportunities when we develop our resources, and in Alaska's case, we don't have a state income tax. We got rid of that in 81. We don't even have a state sales tax. We've relied on our natural resources, just as the framers of the Constitution and the feds said at that point that we needed to. We took that to heart. We developed the North Slope, Prudhoe Bay, Kapart. We've maximized our Cook Inlet reserves as well. We continue to explore going west into the Naval Petroleum Reserve. We've been working for decades to open up the coastal plain in Anwar, which is some considered to be the last best hope for a giant of some size. So 15 years ago, when we were talking about getting Anwar opened up, we had envisioned and had discussions about how many companies would come to bid on those leases. Well, as a result of this new culture, this new approach to disengaging from the Arctic and disengaging from Alaska, the only bidders a week and a half ago was a state corporation called Ada and two small companies bid Ada bid on 9 tracts, the two small companies bid on 11 tracts. This is in the largest potential oil prospect supposedly in North America. So you can see how effective these groups, these individuals have been at basically cowing people into not considering this as an investment. So what we have going on, and it started here a long time ago, but it's coming to a development or prospect near you, is this idea that we're going to cancel everything. Cancel those that are for resource development. Cancel the projects. Cancel the investment source. We had 2 weeks ago several senators that sent letters to the national insurance agencies and other groups saying that we do not want you investing in Alaska and the Arctic. So essentially what we have going on here is an attempt to destroy a state within the federal system, to turn it into nothing more than a national park. I was just in a conversation yesterday with our Inupiaq people in the state of Alaska. The state of Alaska has the largest Native American population of any state in the country. 15% of our population is Native Alaskan. My wife of 32 years is an Eskimo lady from a remote village on a remote river. In the 70s, Alaska, when we settled this Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, we didn't develop reservations as you have in the lower 48. We only have one small reservation in southeast Alaska. The rest of the state, through the ANCSA law, developed corporations. Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, multi-billion-dollar operation now. The Northwest Native Arctic Association, the NANAS Corporation, large mining prospect at the Red Dog Mine, lead zinc. And subsequently, several more corporations were developed in an effort to develop their lands so that they would not become caught in a trap like in your tribal systems and your reservation systems. They wanted to give these people an opportunity. So I was on the phone yesterday, we were talking about the oil. This is the corporation that's up on the slope. And we're going to be fighting these issues arm in arm, because the idea that we're going to send Alaska back into the Stone Age doesn't resonate well with many of our Alaskan folks and our Alaskan Native folks who want responsible development. And so you've got Goldman Sachs, you've got Wells Fargo, you've got others who have their own issues, if you read the paper, in terms of being fined for activities that they've conducted internationally and here in the country, saying they're not going to invest in Alaska. And what I would leave you folks with is this. If they can do it here, they can even accomplish this in Texas. It may take them time. It may take them money. It may take them a lot of resources. But this is a committed movement that almost resembles a religious zealots. And if we don't work together, if we don't band together, what we're going to end up with is, as was mentioned in the intro, very expensive energy that is going to impact the poorest of the poor. And the other thing I would say is this: many of these projects that we're talking about, and we're getting our mining, we're getting our mining case canceled. Whether it's Pebble Mine, for example, Pebble Mine is on state land, and the Army Corps of Engineers decided to yank a permit before there's even the permit and study process completed because of politics. So, with that said, we've got a lot of work ahead of us. We're behind the curve. This stuff started many, many years ago. We saw it over our shoulders. We heard about it here and there. I don't think we took it seriously. That allowed these groups and this movement and this mindset to gain some momentum. And lo and behold, we wake up on November 3rd, and then January 6th, and it's a whole new world. And so with that, I mean, I could go on, and I'd be more than happy to answer questions throughout this conference. But we took matters into our own hands with ANWR. State corporation bought those leases, so we have an opportunity to develop those leases for Alaska. That oil, if there is oil there, would be produced and put into the TAPS pipeline along with oil from Prudhoe and Capart up in the North Slope. But we have an obligation. This isn't an afterthought. We are compelled by our Constitution and our history to develop our resources, and these groups are trying to stop it. We let Goldman Sachs know, and we let others know. We will be developing legislation to remove them from making a profit in the state of Alaska. We are not going to join with anybody that is at crossways with our compelling constitutional and statehood arguments for development. That would be crazy. And we've already had those conversations, and we'll be working through that legislation to do the best we can to disassociate ourselves with anybody and everyone. These groups are declaring war on the state of Alaska. And I know this is language that in the last couple of days, some folks would caution us from using, but I don't know how else you word it. This is what's occurring, and we're gonna fight it. So with that, I'll stop. It's a wake-up call. We're gonna have to come up with some different ways to finance some of these projects. But if these folks win in the end, cheap energy in the form of fossil fuels will be in the history books.
That's exactly right.
And we'll be looking at a future that may end up being more costly.
Well,
So
thank you,
that,
Governor.
thank you for the opportunity to open up and speak.
Yep, appreciate your leadership on the issue. Certainly, we're looking at model legislation similar here in Texas. We've seen stuff filed in Indiana, and Governor Mark Gordon in Wyoming, when he was the treasurer, did the same thing with Bank of the West and removed millions of dollars out of their accounts. Hopefully, Texas will follow suit and do the same. But let's go ahead and get started with our panel conversation. I want to introduce on my far left, if maybe your far right, for those of you here live in the audience, Rupert Darwall, fresh in from London. It was supposed to be Senator Charles Perry from Lubbock. The accent's a little different between Rupert and Charles. But, you know, Senator Perry is actually in session on the floor right now. We appreciate his leadership on this issue. We've been talking for over a year on this, working with Lieutenant Governor's staff. But they're in session, and so what do? We send a private jet out and pick up Rupert from London this morning, No, we didn't do that. He just happened to be in Austin, and probably somebody that I would consider the most published person on this particular topic in the world just happens to be here. And so Rupert Darwall, thank you so much. You're a graduate of Cambridge University, former investment banker at Swiss Bank Corporation, before becoming a special advisor to the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the UK Treasury in 1993. You went on to co-found one of London's leading think tanks. You were a consultant to the Conservative Party during the 2005 general election. And as I mentioned, one of the most published authors on the subject, the author, The Age of Global Warming, A History in 2013, and then Green Tyranny, Exposing the Totalitarian Roots of the Climate Industrial Complex, which was published in 2017, and we did a primer on that. To my immediate left, your right, Chris Wright here in the middle. Just an enthusiastic and charismatic speaker on the subject, travels the world, and is going to add a lot to this panel. He serves as CEO and chairman of the board of Liberty Oilfield Services, also founded and serves as executive chairman of Liberty Resources, a Bakken-focused exploration production company, and Liberty Midstream Solutions. He has spoken on energy at the UK House of Lords, the state's attorneys general, federal and states judges, and given over 100 talks. He completed his undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering at MIT and graduate work in electrical engineering at UC Berkeley and MIT. He founded Pinnacle Technologies, and from 1992 to 2006 served as the CEO. He's currently on the board of directors for Urban Solutions Group, U.S. Ceramics, and the Federal Reserve Bank Denver branch. So welcome, Rupert, Chris. Governor, thank you so much. Let's get this conversation started. Chris, I know the governor was talking about some of the things that you're passionate about, but really, how has this energy discrimination impacted your business or people that you may compete with? Does it not just hurt your bottom line, but the livelihood of your employees? Tell us about some of the impacts of this energy discrimination.
Yeah, I'll hit two real quick. You know, one, we're a public company now, and we have a term debt that's going to come due next fall. So we've got 18 or 19 months, and banks in this group independent of how our financials are, want to pull out. They want to apply less credit to the energy industry, and a number of them just want to leave. Now, part of that's because our industry has had a very rough patch financially. I get that part, but it's more than that. There are banks that just want to exit. It's independent of credit conditions. They're going to leave this sector. We're a strong company. We have a good position. We're going to get through that. It'll increase our cost of capital. But think of smaller companies or companies that are on the edge that are struggling a little bit through these tough times. A lot of those companies are going to be tipped over and disappear because of this positioning of the banks. A little bit more about the second one, right? So we employ about 3,000 people today. And think of we've got an awesome gal who's an attorney in our company, hard driving, super successful. We've got a fantastic finance and accounting team. We have a supply chain team that I think could teach Dell or Apple a thing or two. But none of those people are oil and gas people, right? They're just business professionals that have chosen to go work in our industry. How long are those people going to stay? Their neighbors go home and they don't look evil, but they must be. Some of them that live in the city don't tell their neighbors what they do and what industry they work in. That's just crazy. I mean, it is discordant with reality. So we do a lot in our company to talk about our industry, our mission, our passion, and why it matters. And it's not only not bad, it's actually noble and empowering for the world. A couple quick things there. Number one of the things I say about our industry is we're the industry that no other modern industry could exist without. No industry that you recognize today would be like it was without our industry. To go broader back in that, when the oil and gas industry started about 150 years ago, since then, human life expectancy has doubled. With barely moving throughout all of human history, people live twice as long today, enabled by the advent of our industry. And so since I was born, when I was a kid, I went to college to work on fusion energy because we were running out of oil and gas. Graduate school, I worked in solar energy and geothermal after. I wasn't an oil and gas guy by any stretch. I'm in the oil and gas industry because it's what runs the world, and as far as I can see, it's what will run the world. Last number on that, so oil and gas and coal, hydrocarbons, provide a little more than 80% of total world energy today, roughly the same amount when I was born. Almost no trend between then. If you look just at the oil and gas sector, last year, highest market share ever in where United States got energy, right? Highest market share ever last year. And if you think of, we provide 80-some% of global energy, the other 17 or 18%, none of it possible without oil and gas. There's 100 tons of coal inside every wind turbine, right? That's what steel is. It's iron and carbon put into it by burning natural gas at very high temperature. Wind turbine blades are made out of oil. Solar, hydropower, nuclear, geothermal that I've worked on, all these other things that provide, say, 17, 18% of global energy, impossible without oil and gas. So I don't care where energy comes from, but it has to power our society and give people opportunity. And people in our industry need to believe in that they work in a noble industry. We'll talk in a second about poverty. That's my single biggest passion about why what we do matters. And as the governor said, why the cost and quantity and availability of what we do impacts people's lives, particularly low-income people.
Thanks, Chris, so much. Well, I think with the governor's comments about Trump being the best president for Alaska since the creation of the state, and your comments about wind and solar not being possible without coal and oil and gas, I think all the leftist heads have exploded, and there aren't the keep it in the ground movement people on the Zoom anymore. But Rupert, let's talk about during the Obama administration, the threat to our energy industries came from the EPA and regulation. In other words, the administrative state. Now we're seeing huge investors such as BlackRock. Let me emphasize here for a second. BlackRock in 2017 owned at least a 5% stake in over 90% of the companies traded in the S&P 500. At least a 5% stake. They're worth they manage $7.3 trillion. That'd be the third largest GDP in the world. So investors such as BlackRock regulating corporations through ESG. Could you give us your perspective on this, Rupert?
Yeah, sure, Jason. It's great to be joining you. It's great to be here. I think we're seeing the most determined assault on American capitalism that there's been since the 1930s. But what makes this particularly threatening is and dangerous is where the assault is coming from. And it's not the usual suspects. It's in addition to the usual suspects, I should say. It's not just from left politicians or the bureaucrats of the administrative state. Back in the 1940s, the economist Joseph Schumpeter described the publicly traded corporation as capitalism's vulnerable fortresses. And who is attacking these vulnerable fortresses? Well, it's an inside job mounted from Wall Street. It's insiders such as Mike Bloomberg and BlackRock's Larry Fink. And these people don't go to bed at night worried about income inequality or the hollowing out of the blue-collar economy. But the environment for them is a different matter. God might be dead, but the planet needs to be saved. During the Obama administration, we saw the administrative state in the form of the EPA attempt to decarbonize America's electrical power grid, an attempt that was actually struck down or stayed by the Supreme Court. But now we have ESG. We have the big three index fund providers led by BlackRock. We have Mike Bloomberg's Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. BlackRock is pushing ESG as part of its marketing pitch to millennials who put improving society ahead of generating profits. Much of the buy-side pressure for ESG comes from state and municipal pension funds playing politics with pensioners and taxpayers' money. ESG, simply put, is politics continued by other means, especially climate policy and energy policy. We hear a lot about climate risk disclosure. So here are some quotes about what's underlying this. Quote, "The capital markets can affect the course of climate change for the better," former Treasury Secretaries Hank Paulson and Robert Rubin write in the forward to the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board paper on climate risk. Quote, "The goal cannot be transparency for transparency's sake. Disclosure should be means to achieving a more sustainable and inclusive capitalism," says BlackRock's Larry Fink. "Climate change is the biggest threat to America and the world, full stop," Mike Bloomberg said in February last year, just as the COVID pandemic was about to strike the world. "How do you replace dirty energy?" he asked. "Stop rewarding companies from making it. The intent is crystal clear." This is not about investment. And it's not really about inclusive capitalism, because really this is the very definition of exclusive capitalism, where a handful of Wall Street billionaires end up taking political decisions on behalf of the whole of society. The idea of ESG underpinning a parallel government with its capital on Wall Street has been articulated by Matt Levine, a lawyer and former Goldman Sachs investment banker who writes a lot for Bloomberg Opinion. Quote, "There is a government of the US consisting of a president and Congress and so forth, chosen through more or less democratic processes, and it makes big collective decisions for society. And there is a second government consisting of a handful of gigantic institutional asset managers, BlackRock, Vanguard, Fidelity, etc. BlackRock makes decisions on broad social and environmental issues," he says, "and then companies are somewhat compelled to do what BlackRock decides." Don't you just love the somewhat, like the offer that you can't refuse? There is a host of problems regulating companies via ESG. Not least, it puts American companies at a huge competitive disadvantage compared to those operating in countries or from countries where climate targets are weak or non-existent. But the two most important, I think, are first the lack of democratic legitimacy. And the second is on capitalism itself, its ability to drive growth and rising prosperity. Turning corporations into public sector bureaucracies will see them delivering public sector outputs. It's an immensely destructive double whammy. So I hope this sort of helps frame the issue. It's not just about turning off the capital to oil and gas companies. It's about fundamentally remodeling American society.
Great answer. Governor, if you're still on, I'd love to hear about some of the economic impacts to those economically disadvantaged communities in Alaska that this discrimination by financial institutions, how would that affect those communities? And maybe some insight on some of the new projects that have recently been approved. I think you partnered with the BLM on some new pebble mines that will help communities. Tell us a little bit about some of the economic impacts in Alaska.
Thank you. So the interesting thing about a lot of these resource development projects is they're located in the poorest places of our state. In other words, by developing these projects, you don't just get wealth. This is not about, what some of these groups will tell you, this is about corporate destruction of the environment, et cetera. In Alaska, these plays, whether it's Pebble Mine, whether it's Anwar, whether it's the Tongass in southeast Alaska, but mainly up in the northern part of the state of Alaska and the western part of the state of Alaska, these finds are placed conveniently near some of the poorest places there are in the state of Alaska. So I'll give you an example. The lead zinc mine up in the northwest Arctic part of the state of Alaska, north of a place called Kotzebue, one of the largest lead zinc mines in the world, employs at least 56%, if not a little more, Native Alaskans from that region. So in essence, what it's helped do is lift those people out of poverty, generational poverty, and given them an opportunity to be able to partake in the world that the rest of us have taken for granted. On the North Slope, where Kapark is, Prudhoe Bay is, Anwar is, within Anwar, the confines of Anwar, is an Inupiaq Eskimo community called Paktobit that lived there forever. They are huge proponents of onshore oil and gas development. They benefit directly from that. My wife, who's Inupiaq Eskimo, in talking to her mother before she passed away, there was a question raised. Mom, what was it like in the good old days? And her response was, they weren't good old days. And she talked about a whole litany of unbelievable adversity that they had to deal with just to survive. Well, the development of these plays and the development of these finds create jobs that are often $100,000 plus jobs for workers that in any other situation without a college degree, you'd be paid $9 an hour. And so you not only help the poorest of the poor when you're exploring, you not only help the poorest of the poor if you develop and you hire these people, you change the culture of poverty, and in many cases, you're producing the very fuel, and in our case in Alaska, the minerals needed for batteries for electrical storage and electronic parts. You're producing this in a manner that's environmentally friendly, but you're producing this so that you can get affordable product. In the case of energy that generates cheaper electricity, abundant electricity, and in the case of mining that develops cheaper gadgets, cheaper electronics, cheaper storage as well. So this is a destructive event across the globe, but it's starting here in Alaska. But in any event, not to belabor this, in Alaska, oftentimes these potential projects are sitting right next to some of the poorest people in this country and in the state of Alaska.
Excellent, thank you. Chris, let's talk about some of your experience traveling around the world and how expensive energy hurts the poor. And let's talk about the energy poverty and poverty aspect.
You bet. Yeah, my brother and I, when we were young, wanted to climb mountains and travel the world. I've been to over 50 countries, you know, and to me, the biggest appeal really is to see the people and see, it's almost like a time machine. It's to see how our society was before, it's to see different cultures and different histories. But one thing I'll set out, look, the debate about ESG, and I'm a board member of an environmental group. I'm socially passionate about what we do, so it isn't like I don't like the idea of ESG. It's the way it's done and the way it's talked about. And mostly, of course, it's a dialogue of wealthy people from wealthy countries among wealthy people in wealthy countries. You know, it's a tiny sliver of the world that argues and preens back and forth. And usually quite a naive segment of that population. So what's the state of the world today? A third of humanity, a third, still uses for cooking fuel the same thing all of our ancestors did, which is to burn wood, dung, or agricultural waste indoors. It's quaint to have a fireplace in my house sometimes. It's not quaint if that's the way you cook your food and that's the way you stay warm. I've spent a number of times in these huts. They're very smoky, they're very unsafe, and women who do most of the work in traditional society spend over an hour a day gathering wood, dung, and agricultural waste every day to cook food. Well, why do you have to cook it? Well, for humans to liberate calories from the grains we grow. They're complex carbohydrates. We have a smaller digestive system. We can't liberate that energy without breaking them down by cooking. This is essential. This, by World Health Organization estimates, kills over 3 million people a year. Every year. Twice the global deaths from COVID last year. Every single year, right? But that's a poor person problem, so it isn't even talked about. Easily fixable. Outdoor air pollution kills another 2 or 3 million people. Lack of access to water, illiteracy, basic medicine, all of them not possible without access to low-cost energy. We have way more than 10 million lives easily could be saved every year with expanded energy access. And we're moving there. These numbers were dramatically worse 20 years ago. But now there's actually headwinds. So I was in Tanzania with my family a year and a half ago. We had a fabulous trip, met a bunch of people that we're still in touch with, and believe me, the economic upbringing, the shocks of COVID are much worse there than they are here. In Tanzania, 85% of the population uses traditional fuels. Only 15% have modern indoor clean cooking fuels. But because of the shale revolution, surging, think propane. Propane production from the United States has been a godsend. That is the thing. When you leave wood and dung and agricultural waste behind and you get your next step, it's what we would think of. Think of the Coleman cooking stoves you saw when you were a kid and a propane canister. That is game-changing for people's lives. There are 6 companies in Tanzania now that are actively competing to get these stoves out there to sell the canisters. When somebody raises that economic threshold and they can switch to that, education in that household, health in that household, the future in that household just changed. That's an economic consideration. When can they buy LPG instead of spend over an hour to search for wood? Yet, the World Bank in 2010 stopped lending for hydrocarbons in poor countries. A bunch of commercial banks are doing it. USAID. We're now in an active effort to slow people that live the way our ancestors lived and want to live like we live, and we're stopping them. We're getting in the way and trying to hurt it. It's beyond reprehensible. Sheikh Hasina, Prime Minister of Bangladesh, was at a Davos conference, and Al Gore wagged his finger at her and said she shouldn't be building these coal plants. Right? A huge amount of people in Bangladesh don't have electricity. Imagine walking home tonight, no electricity. We're in the wintertime, no lights, no ability to charge anything. How are you going to watch TV? Right? There's still 1 billion people with no access to electricity, 1 billion with only very intermittent and low enough level electricity doesn't help raise their incomes. Right? That is by far and away the biggest world global energy challenge. Climate change is the other one, but it's massively slower moving and massively smaller. But people don't look at the data and they won't speak honestly about that. Last thing I'll say, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, right, the authority, the UN bureaucracy set up to study this. They do economic studies too, to try to estimate impacts. And they publish them. Have you ever read about them? Do you ever see them in the press? Well, there's a reason you don't. So the IPCC Assessment Report 5, the last one fully out, 6 is trickling out right now. In Assessment Report 5, they estimated what is the economic impact of 2 degrees C from pre-industrial times warming. So we're warming right now at 0.14 degrees C a decade. If you extrapolate that, sometime around the end of this century, 70, 80 years from now, we'll hit 2 degrees C from pre-industrial times. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change estimates that will reduce personal income, wide range, it's a projection about the future, somewhere between 0.2% and 2%. So the middle of that, significantly less than the economic loss of 1 recession. So if over the next 80 years, we have 1 extra recession that we might have otherwise had, that's about the impact of climate change on people's well-being this century from the IPCC. Yet, 1/3 of humanity, dying millions a year with huge health problems, lack of education and time, lack of electricity, that's okay. That's not okay. We're writing, well, we're not calling it ESG. It is our ESG report. We're going to publish our first report, and it's called Human Flourishing and Sustainability. We're going to lay out what's actually happening with energy poverty, what could move the needle, what drives us, which is to get energy to the third of humanity that don't have lives like us. And this is not just a poor country problem. Jason, let me be really quick here. I lived in California for 19 years, right? Silicon Valley, Hollywood, aerospace industry, the most awesome real estate in the world, right? This is an incredibly wealthy state. California didn't squeak by, they screamed by Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana as the highest adjusted poverty rate in the nation. Now, how do they do that? They did a lot of, they don't believe in they're moving towards top down, the way the world always worked. But one of the killer things there is the price of energy, right? They're supposedly saving the environment by redoing where they get energy from, right? So their electricity prices are 50% higher than the country as a whole. Their commercial electricity prices are 80% higher. So if you're low income, you're priced to fill your gas tank and heat your home and cook your food. It's a meaningful part of your income for low income people. Further, blue collar people work in energy intensive jobs. You know, if you're a trucker or a farmer or energy intensive manufacturing, those are high paying blue collar jobs. They've left California. So we've left the jobs, put the burden on them, and they don't even talk about this. Now politicians are rebelling in California, or starting it. But that happened the 19 years I lived there, continued to drive up the price of energy. And for what? For what? California's percent of energy from fossil fuels, total all-in fossil fuel energy today, slightly higher than the national average. All of that, Germany, my last example, Germany has invested $340 billion over the last decade. Scale that up to the size of the US economy, $1.5 trillion. And in 2010, they got 80% of their energy from fossil fuels. What do you think they get today? 80% went to 79%, right? They have triple US electricity prices and tens of thousands of premature deaths because low-income elderly people don't cool their homes to safe temperatures when it's hot in the summer, and they don't heat them to warm temperatures. This is not a rational evaluation of trade-offs for the environment, for taking care of people.
It's great, Chris. Thank you so much. Expensive energy hurts the poor, whether they're poor in Africa and developing countries, or they're poor here in the United States or Eastern European countries that you would think would not have suffering like they do. But unfortunately, we do, and that expensive energy certainly does hurt the poor. I love you talking about the IPCC. Our Dr. Brent Bennett has run the numbers, and if we eliminate all of the CO2 emissions from the United States by 2030, as called through in the Green New Deal, by 2100, the temperature differential is less than 0.2 of a degree. That's eliminating all, and that's using the same model that the UN uses with the IPCC. It's all for naught. Like you talked about, climate is changing. It's mild and manageable, and we are world leaders in environmental protection. So I'm glad you brought up some of those. The other part about empowering women that you touched on a little bit about walking to collect the biomass. Katie Tuawa, our communications manager, has a great piece on our website, lifepower.org. If you really want to empower women, get them access to electricity. Women around the world spend 200 million hours a day walking to collect water. Imagine that if we could then open up opportunities, get them access to electricity. Think of the civic opportunities, opportunities to start new businesses, opportunities to get an education. And Katie wrote a great piece on that. I highly encourage you to go and read that, and please media cite that all you wish. Rupert, let's talk a little bit about retirees and their money that's being directed away from these investments. How is it going to impact them?
Well, ESG, I mean, the strapline of ESG is doing well by doing good. But when you actually look at what actually happens, if you look at the data, it's not quite as simple as that. And it's obviously counterintuitive to believe that if you eliminate 4/5 of the stocks from an index to get socially an ESG fund, and you eliminate not just energy companies, but defense contractors, companies producing GMOs and so forth. You shrink your portfolio, you slap an ESG label on it, and you charge investors 5 times as much. It's hardly surprising that your returns will be hit. And there's a very interesting thing that CalPERS, the Californian state pension fund, it decided to divest in about 2000, to divest from tobacco on ethical grounds. And its consultants reckoned that that cost the fund about $3 billion. So it's not just that ESG is bad for business. It's also bad for investors.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Before we open it up to Q&A, we'll get our microphones ready. I think Mackenzie will have those in the back. Last question for the governor from me before we open up to our audience panel. Governor, we heard this morning from the Texas Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, referencing an anti-BDS bill that was passed in 2017 in the state of Texas that said that if you were boycotting, divesting, or sanctioning the state of Israel, then you are no longer welcome to do business with the state of Texas. And he is proposing and says that he will have priority legislation this Texas legislative session that says that if you're boycotting, divesting, or sanctioning oil and gas, then you're no longer going to be welcome to do business with the state of Texas. Tell us a little bit about what you think a proposal would be, or any other ideas that you might have to push back against some of this energy discrimination by financial institutions.
We're looking at everything from policy to legislation. We are looking at everything from legislation and resolutions. We've taken them seriously. We're going to answer the call, and we are not going to go quietly in the night. We are going to stand up in any form possible to fight back on this. We'll be having conversations with Texas and places like Wyoming and North Dakota and South Dakota and others, like-minded states, to join forces potentially in a resource defense action, if necessary, against some of these outfits as well as potential agencies in this new administration. Because for us, we are the least diversified economy in the country. And as I mentioned on the historical background, we need resource development. So we're in a fight. We're going to use every tool we possibly can. We'll be working with folks such as your folks in Texas as well as other states. But we're turning over every stone possible. And right now, we're looking at administrative orders as well as introducing legislation.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to working with you. Mackenzie, you've got the microphones, I believe. Any questions? Roger Keats, back here in the middle, in the back. Yes.
Thanks. Yeah. First, a comment. Back, we used to be a little bit in the energy industry, and I always used to say the environmental movement is the most racist political movement in America and in the whole world, because you look at, by and large, the people who are suffering from lack of energy and how it holds on the economy are minorities, whether it's Africa, Asia, or whatever. And right now, racism is a lot hotter term than poverty. So it might be better to refer to us as the racist industry. But coming in a quick story, we've got kids who live in Barcelona, Spain, in the old section. It's really nice. Almost no one has air conditioning. Now, anyone who's been to Barcelona in summer knows their weather's just like Austin's during the summer. And virtually no one can afford air conditioning because their power is so expensive. Now to come to my actual question, I just want to make those questions. Under the 10th Amendment, we know that under, who are out in Washington now, they are going to try to damage our energy industry. Under the 10th Amendment, I'd love to have a state sometime and just say, when the feds come in, just say, up yours, get out. And whether it's Alaska, who I think could get away with it easier, although Alaska or Texas, somebody has to take a stand and say no. Because you read the Constitution, they're way past that. Where can we apply the 10th Amendment? Could we try it in Texas? And would anybody have the nerve to take on the bureaucracy and just tell them to get lost?
I think we have some attorneys at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, our litigation team at the Center for the American Future, that are looking to do just that. And there might be some announcements next week on that particular issue. But we're fortunate here in Texas, as the governor from Alaska mentioned, most of the land is privately owned. There's not a lot of federal land in the state of Texas, and that's probably our biggest benefit. Governor, did you have any comments on that from an Alaskan standpoint?
Yeah, we've been fighting the feds for some time, ever since we came into the 90s especially. But I think we all seriously have to have a conversation about coming up with some type of state resource alliance, because again, what they're going to try and do is they're going to try and convince you guys that Alaska is a special situation, that you know, we're not interested in South Dakota or North Dakota or Texas. We're just trying to protect Alaska. But you know how these things go. Once that happens, once there's a success there and this state ceases to be a state and goes into receivership under the feds and becomes a big park, they're going to find something beautiful about Texas that Texans are really doing wrong, and that they need to be re-educated as to how to do things the right way. So I don't think we wait any longer, to be perfectly honest with you. I think we and I've begun those conversations, for example, with our Governors Association, and we'll expedite those conversations. But it's clear to us, and all I'm saying to you guys is this: we are the canary in the mine, and we've been in the canary in the mine for some time. What would have been major oil companies tripping over themselves to get leases in Anwar, there were none. That's what you're facing.
Yeah. Any other questions? Think Mackenzie to your left.
So my question is for the whole panel, but so for the energy narrative that's been going on, a lot of the public opinion has fallen away from fossil fuels, but I mean, as we're listening here, the human flourishing, moral argument, the economic argument, so far it doesn't change the mind of a green believer. Hit them over the head with the reality, they think they can negotiate with it. So I'm kind of curious what the next step in presenting an argument for better energy that, I mean, it helps people economically, it helps people with human flourishing. How do we better wrap that argument?
I mean, I'll say from my perspective, yeah, I've been speaking on climate change for 15, 18 years. It was a business line at my original technology company to measure CO2 sequestration. Now they call it carbon capture and underground storage. So, hey, it was a business opportunity for me. So I would speak about the science and the feedbacks, and I still do that. But I think to reach the younger audience, I speak in high schools and at universities and all that. To me, I speak about poverty and human opportunity. And what it means, you know, why did we rise up and live longer or whatever, and what about these people that don't? And then, you know, walk through sort of the trade-offs with what we're doing with climate change and what that means. Look, I think the younger generation today, they're very passionate. My company, they want to make the world a better place. They're just simply the most economically secure generation that's ever been born, right? So they're less worried as we were about getting up and making sure we had a future, and they want to be part of a mission, to be part of a cause. I think it's mostly, among the young people, mostly naivete. They just don't know. They think the planet is really going to hell, and that's what's the threat to people. And I mean, that's all they've heard. How would they not know that? But I get remarkably positive reactions. I spoke at CU Boulder, you know, in a debate with the mayor of Boulder and two professors about oil and gas. And I had a giant line at the end, you know, of people that just said, I had no idea. I didn't realize it. So I think it's a long game, but, and obviously Life Powered at TPP is doing that. It's how do we reach younger people who in turn will ultimately influence politicians. I think we win in the end, but it is a generational battle. And you'll see in California, you know, the Black and Hispanic delegations in the State House in California are becoming increasingly outspoken. Who are the victims of this California policy? It is low-income people, it's job opportunity. So I'm always an optimist, but it is a long-term battle, but we have to change people's hearts and minds. And you're right, economics doesn't do it, but justice and poverty and people's opportunity, I think, does. I hope.
Yeah, and those seem to be the largest movers of polls. If you talk about people that change their mind from being anti-fossil fuels or anti-hydrocarbons, you talk about energy poverty, and you talk about women walking 200 million hours a day, get them access to energy, you lift them out of poverty. That moves people here in the United States, and that's really what our messaging is geared around. We talk about we're a world leader in environmental quality, and I talk about economic prosperity and environmental quality go hand in hand. I've advocated and will continue to advocate to members of Congress in the current administration and the next administration that we shouldn't have a Paris Accord, we should have a Pittsburgh Accord. And we should look at the air quality improvements that we've made in the United States in the last 50 years. We've reduced harmful pollution 77%. And it's gone down 7% in this current administration. People thought, oh, it's going to get horrible. It didn't. It continues to prove, and it's American leadership, American innovation, and the market that has done that. It's not regulation, it was the market that started that. And so we should be calling on our trading partners to meet our air quality standards for harmful pollution. You look at in Los Angeles, 65% of the ozone in Southern California is Asian air pollution. So we export jobs, we import pollution. We've got cheap energy here in the US. Let's reshore those jobs. Let's manufacture goods with our environmental leadership and improve global air quality. But that's what we should be calling on our trading partners to do, is meet our air quality standards around the world. And those two are the measures that move people the most, poverty and air quality. And we talk about our leadership here in the United States a lot within the Life Powered Project. Tyler. Tyler's written some great pieces. Tyler Corder, check him out. He's written some great op-eds that have been published around the country. I highly encourage you to go read some of his work.
Thanks, Jason. So for ESG, I'm in the energy industry as well, and I think the focus is always, like you've mentioned, on environment, the E piece. And now you've laid out an excellent case for how, and TPP has done the same thing on the S piece, social. But I haven't heard a lot about governance. You have these large energy companies, or companies in general, who are kowtowing to these financial groups, or they're just not, they seem not to respond well to pressure. They feel like they're not governing or managing these risks, climate change, et cetera. They don't really know how to manage. And so from a millennial perspective, it seems, I wouldn't say incompetence of management, but no one knows really what to do. So the question is, what is the fix? What are we seeing, at the state level, the private level, people responding in a way to face the financial sector?
I mean, governance for the investor world in our industry has mostly been directed at executive pay and alignment. Just our industry's had a terrible decade of return on capital, and pay hasn't really gone down. And I think there's very legitimate critiques about the state of governance as far as executive pay and how boards work. So I think there is room for improvement there in our industry. I think the industry is responding to that. You raise a whole nother perspective that I do think is important. You're right, I have not seen much there. And we are, we're passionate believers in our company. So we're publishing this report that's gonna inflame some people, but I'm happy to do that. I want to say, look, as I say, there's two global energy challenges: energy poverty and climate change. I want to put them both in context and what drives us. We want to make progress on both of them, but one of them is larger, immediate, and urgent. So our bigger efforts are on that, but we're making progress over here on the climate change side, as long as it doesn't hamper the bigger issue. And we're probably going to get some interesting dialogues about that. But I'll tell you, a bunch of our investors are very happy to see this report come out, because they're getting pressure, from the people behind them. And what we want is an open airing of the dialogue. Kids just assume today all other environmental issues are passé and human issues. It's all about climate change. And everyone, including too many people on our side, have accepted calling CO2 a pollutant. We've reduced our pollution more than the other guys. Water vapor, oxygen, and CO2 are the three molecules without which life on Earth is impossible. It's a real issue, CO2. It does absorb infrared radiation and all that, but it's crazy that we call it a pollutant. You go to colleges and university, everyone thinks it's toxic and it's a pollutant. You can never use that term for CO2.
Can I pick up the G point, because you're absolutely right. There's a major incoherence there, which G for governance. So it's meant to be shareholders, and it's stockholders is the idea that the stockholder. But at the same time, the big three index funds and also the business leaders business roundtable last year talked about stakeholder capitalism. So you have this huge tension between G being about shareholders and G being about stakeholders, and it's incoherent. It's kind of unresolvable. The other thing is about climate risk disclosures, and I think these are systematically misleading, because the idea is that the more CO2 a company emits or is responsible for, the higher the risk. But actually, the risk crystallizes, if you like, the future liability or the future costs depend where that CO2 is being emitted. carbon dioxide, climate policies are regulated by nation states, or in the US to a certain degree by individual states. And there are very few corporations whose operations are coterminous with a nation state. So you're actually getting complete systematically misleading data from this allegedly stuff that's meant to inform investors' risk appetite, risk assessment.
Thank you, Rupert. Chris, we are right, and I apologize. We've got a question from the overflow room, and that's been the overflow capacity. I apologize. If you can make it really quick, we've got about 30 seconds.
Yeah. Hey, Jason. How you doing?
Great.
Mike Cannon. Hey, you know, the issue about getting to the young people remind me of a conversation I had with my granddaughter, one of my granddaughters, about a year ago. And she's totally clueless in terms of what the oil and gas and what the energy world is all about. And you know, it seems to me that in this may be something you already have, but some sort of a tutorial process that you might be able to provide through your supporters and donors that we could pass out to those that we have credibility with. Might be a way to reach young people, certainly outside of Texas, those of us that have children and grandchildren that are elsewhere. And I don't know, you may already have that, but to the extent that you
For the
don't,
perfect segue for our panel that we're having tomorrow on education, we've also just published a white paper written by Bud Brigham. If you look at the online on policy orientation, the description for this panel, you'll find a link to be able to download that white paper. But we're going to talk education in our panel tomorrow. Please give it up for our panel, Governor Dunleavy from Alaska, Chris Wright, Rupert Darwall. Thank you so much. Appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for joining.